today we're going to be chatting about inverse functions. Okay, so it's very important that you have a solid understanding and foundation in functions because you will be examined on it in grade 12. So functions, at least your 4 functions, straight line, parabola, hyperbola, and exponential, doesn't really change from grade 11 to grade 12. The only difference is now that we also chat about inverse functions, which we'll get into today. So make sure that you do understand that from grade 11. Okay, so basically what inverse functions are, it's a reflection of our function. Okay, also understand that there's different ways that they can ask you to find the inverse of the function, and I'll chat about maybe the 3 different ways now. Okay, so firstly, the notation that we use, right, to indicate the inverse of function is this: f to the negative 1 of x, given that my function obviously is f of x. Okay, so what is happening when we are inversing a function is basically we are reflecting our function over the line y is equal to x. Okay, so if we have over there my y-axis, my x-axis, right, the line y equal to x goes right over there. It's a unit line through origin, meaning that, let's take another color over here, when my x-axis value is 1, the corresponding y value is 1 as well. So it's a unit line. If this is negative 4, if I match it up to my y-axis, my y is also going to be negative 4. Right, so the unit line, y is equal to x. So we are reflecting our function over this line. We know, though, from grade 11 and grade 10 that other reflections, for example, over the y-axis, all we do is we change the sign of my x, and when I reflect over my x-axis, we change the sign of my y. Right, so that's 2 reflections that we are familiar with from grade 10 and grade 11. So now when I find the inverse and I reflect over the line y is equal to x, the change that happens is we actually go and we switch the positions of x and y in my function, right? And that is us reflecting over the line y equal to x. I'll do a quick example of that. But we need to still remember what functions are. It's very important, especially when we are inversing. And I'll touch on that, especially when we find the inverse of parabola. But we first need to understand that functions are always written positive y equals to everything else, right? So when we switch the positions of x and y, it's very important for us to ensure that when I rewrite my inverse in this notation, that positive y is alone on one side equal to everything else. So it's very important that also you have an understanding of how to do subject of formula, because that's what we'll be doing over here. Okay, so just touching on what I mentioned now with switching the position and rewriting, I'll do an example with a straight line function to explain. Okay, so let's say we are given f of x is equal to 2x minus 1, right? So we know this is y equal to mx plus c, straight line function. So if they ask me to find the inverse, f to the negative 1, x, right? This already tells me we're finding the inverse. First thing you're going to do is rewrite this in terms of y and x, because you don't want to be working with f of x. So I'm going to say that that is the same as y equals to 2x minus 1. So if I'm finding the inverse, so I'll put it over here, what do? We switch the positions of x and y. So now x is equal to 2y minus 1, right? But we know that my function always needs to be written with positive y equals to everything else. So my job is to get this y positive alone on one side. So subject of the formula, we're going to say take my 1 over first, it's equal to 2y. How do I get my y alone? Divide by 2. Because it's an equation, what I do on one side, I do to the other side as well. So y is equal to x plus 1 over 2, and this over here is my inverse function. So I'll use my proper inverse notation. F to the minus 1x equals to x plus 1 over 2, right? And that is my inverse. Okay, so this is how we would find my inverse, but just how do we know we're supposed to do the inverse? I spoke about the different ways they'll ask it, and these are the 3 different ways, right? Either they will say, given f of x, find f to the minus 1x, right? Because we know that's my inverse notation, so they are asking me to find the inverse. Secondly, they might even just say to find the equation of the inverse, so we know we need to inverse. And lastly, they might say reflect this function over the line y is equal to x, right? And remember, this is what we do when we're finding the inverse. So any one of these 3 things, we're doing the same thing, switching the position of x and y, rewriting in terms of y, and that'll be finding the inverse. So next I'm going to chat about particularly exponential functions inverses and parabola inverses.